morning. Welcome to our session. We're going to give it a few more minutes for people to join. We're going to get started in about 1 minute. Okay, good morning. Welcome to the School of Security Studies conference. My name is Miranda Melcher, and I'm chairing this morning's panel. We are very excited to have you all for this session. I am obliged to tell you that it is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube in perpetuity, so that is your notice. Today's panel is going to be focusing on this overall theme of order and chaos, looking specifically at post-conflict civil wars. How do we understand this complexity? And so this panel is also showcasing the wonderful talent we have in the School of Security Studies. I am a PhD student in the defense studies side of the school, just finishing up my PhD, and I look at the post-conflict reconstruction processes for integrated militaries with my case studies of Mozambique and Angola. And I am joined on this panel by two fellow PhD students in the School of Security Studies, who not only have made available their time and expertise, but also are calling in from very early in the morning from the East Coast of the United States. So thank you both for being here with your coffee. And if I could ask you each, please, to introduce yourselves briefly, starting with Whitney.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Whitney Grespin, and I just wanted to say thanks for having me, and thanks to Miranda for putting this together, and also to the Defense Studies Department, which is the half of the school that I'm in as well, for all of the support that they've given me through the studentship and small bursaries and other field research. My work looks at the U.S. use of contractors to deliver partner military training.
Thank you. And Stanislava?
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you all. It's almost light in here on the East Coast. We're excited to have this conversation. As Miranda mentioned, I'm a student in the War Studies Department. I was a practitioner for quite a while, as I know most of us here on this panel have, and I'm looking at the relationship between special operations forces, and particularly civil affairs, who do engagement with civic actors, NGOs, and populations, and so forth, in low intensity conflict, what we call the gray zone. We'll get into this discussion. I'm very excited to be speaking to all of you, and I'm really looking forward to your questions. So thank you, Miranda, for putting this together.
Great. So how this is going to work. I'm going to ask Whitney and Stanislava some questions. We're going to have a conversation essentially about this idea of who are these non-state actors in conflict zones? How does this impact our understanding of what is conflict and what is not? And then we very much invite you to participate as well. You'll see at the bottom of your Zoom screen the Q&A function. There's a chat and a Q&A. They are actually separate in the webinar. And we would kindly ask you to put any questions you come up with in the Q&A button, particularly. If they go into the chat, it's going to be really hard for us to find them. So please put them in the Q&A. We're going to come to them probably at different points during the session. Some might be at the end, some might be throughout. So don't feel like you have to wait for me to say, please put your questions in now. Go ahead and put them in as soon as you think about them. And we'll try and get through to everyone's questions. So what are we trying to figure out? What we're interested in is this idea of this dichotomy between conflict and post-conflict, and how it's way more complicated than that. And that doesn't actually on the ground, particularly with the field work that Stanislava and Whitney have done both in their PhDs and in their careers more broadly, this idea is that there's a lot more complexity happening. And the particular aspect of that complexity that we're interested in digging into this morning is these ideas of non-state actors. And again, often in media, etc., we hear about non-state actors and we kind of think terrorist groups, we think ISIS, we think nasty groups are trying to be governments. But there's a lot of other kinds of non-state actors running around. And also it is often hard to kind of draw the boundary between what is a state actor and what is a non-state actor. Is it to do with chain of command? Is it to do with who pays for things? Is it to do with what they think they are? Is it to do with what civilians think they are? There's actually a lot of room for gray area here. So my first question for each of you, both of you, is when in your research and in your practice, you're dealing with kind of this category of non-state actors, who are they? What are we actually talking about in your particular experience and research area? So I will reverse the order and ask Stanislava to go first.
So thanks so much. I would just give a very quick pitch of this, and then I want to see your thoughts as well. So certainly in my research, as I mentioned, I'm looking at how the U.S. military engages with non-governmental organizations. Just to preface that, SOF in particular, state special operations forces deal with particularly with state actors officially. They go to train other militaries and who basically trying to support them to counter various violent actions and so forth. And in a lot of cases, it's the host nation military who actually provides basic services to its populations, which of course is something which a non-state actor, as you asked, could potentially also be a non-governmental organization. So where there is a void of basic services, whether it be medical or education, you certainly have instances where the military are literally like running these services for the populations. Where it gets interesting is when the US military steps in and also engages with various budgeting authorities to provide some of these kinds of things to win over the populace, if you will. So it almost becomes a competition between them, providing a non-state actor-like service to a civic population. And of course, without, just to give a quick overview, on the non-state actor side, or certainly on the NGO side, as we're discussing here, you have local and international ones, which they themselves compete. And one last thing to throw in, while you mentioned conflict and post-conflict, just to make it even, as messy as mud, oftentimes you have preventative measures on how can we avoid conflict? How can we not get to that point? Because of course, if you have a lack of basic services, if people can't kind of live their normal lives, that in itself is a point of tension. So where I'm looking at it is, before you and Whitney get to it, the conflict, the post-conflict bit, and saying, how can we use these basically vulnerabilities and tension points and take care of them before we get to the conflict and post-conflict bit, so we don't compete with other actors who are also trying to win over the populace. And I'll leave it at that because I know both of you have a lot to say on this topic.
Great, thank you. Whitney, what can you bring in and make it even more complicated?
Oh, well, that was an excellent primer and preface. Before we start, I also just need to say that these opinions are my own and they don't reflect those of any of my affiliations, past or present, blah, blah, blah. I look at contingency contractors, which we can later on get into the nitty gritty of what that captures and the different contracting mechanisms that falls under. But more broadly, if we look at the typology of the kinds of groups that fall under that category, they're also sometimes referred to as mercenaries or private military firms or private military companies or private security companies, and sometimes also crosses over into the profiles of foreign fighters. But my work and kind of how I streamline all that is, again, looking at the contract mechanism and whether the entity falls under a contracting officer and a contracting officer representative in terms of oversight. So they are sanctioned by, hired by, supported by, and overseen by the US government. I would also build on what Stanislava said by saying that contractors are present during all the phases of military operations, and they're typically in theater before and after those military phases. And ideally, contractors should be the facilitators, mentors, or advisors of those state services, rather than really being a standalone force. That's not always what we end up seeing, but in many instances, it's the contractors who end up being able to offer that institutional memory and continuity that stays whenever the troop rotations become more frequent than we'd like to see for the level of familiarity that's really required in those environments to affect change and have those relationships with the partner nation militaries be as effective as possible.
Great, so that's opened up a whole bunch of things that now we can pick into. So first, just to continue on this idea of giving a preface, to help people with their mental geography and place things on a map, what sorts of countries, regions, conflicts are we talking about that you two have particular sort of experience with? I know it's quite a range, so just give us some ideas here. Whitney?
Sure. So my project started in the CENTCOM, the Central Command Area of Responsibility, so the good old CENTCOM AOR, and it really picked up after the 9/11 attacks and the global war on terror. And then as I tracked industry growth during that period, and my professional opportunities led me to work more in the AFRICOM AOR. However, I would assert that contractors are present everywhere that the US government is.
Stanislava, what additions do you want to make to that?
Yeah, of course. Great question. So much like Whitney, a lot of our experiences certainly is related to the big wars. So my background was in Afghanistan. And also on the multilateral level, when I was in NATO for a bunch of years, and you kind of saw partnership, like many countries doing this together. So that is almost a whole other topic in and of itself. But when I decided to do this, I wanted to look at everything that people weren't talking about, because I felt that we had a very strong saturation in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I said, well, we're looking at high conflict. What is all of this looking low conflict, preventative, small scale? So I actually literally went all over the place. So Whitney was talking about the Middle East, CENTCOM. I thought to myself, I'm going to go and identify and see, because it's special operations, some of their stuff is covert, but not always. It may not be outwardly advertised, but particularly this NGO-SOF relationship is something that NGOs sometimes kind of advertise on their websites. They're doing work with these organizations. So I literally came up with my own map. And I have talked to people in probably, not to give you everything, but not even all the countries. I'm still kind of trying to collect the data, but Kenya, Somalia, Lebanon, Jordan, Colombia, Ukraine, Kosovo, you name it. And you can both imagine these are places that are literally across the spectrum. I wanted to look at that because I thought, here's a big war Iraq and Afghanistan, where we've put in so much, where, you know, $50,000 for a military contractor or someone else may mean nothing, but a small village in northern Burkina Faso, which receives some kind of assistance for $10,000, could actually mean the make or break of the relationship with that community. So I thought, what are these missions telling us collectively across about our own functional behavior as an organization and vis-a-vis the relationship with NGOs? Can what happened in Kenya be applied in Senegal, or in Burkina, or applied in Colombia? And one of the things that has come back consistently has been, oh, it's all different. The context is dependent, which is very much true. You certainly cannot compare, East to West and South America and so forth. And yet the organization has kind of a cookie cutter approach when it comes to kicking off its planning and going to navigate these missions and spaces. So I thought, everyone is telling me that it's different, but yet we keep doing it the same. What's broken here? So this is what I'm after, and it's fascinating to be on the outside and asking people inside to talk about themselves and what they think of others who also see themselves through themselves. So it's almost been trying to triangulate several groups vis-a-vis each other.
Great. That actually leads really nicely to my next question, which is, before we get into the ways that this can perhaps go wrong or be complicated or murky, what is supposed to happen? What is this cookie cutter? What is the, on paper, what is meant to happen? What is the purpose of these interactions? So before we get into kind of what actually happens in reality, what is the understanding in probably a small office somewhere on the East Coast of the United States when these sorts of things are being planned? Whitney, do you want to start off?
Sure, thanks for that. And yeah, it can be pretty labyrinthine, especially I look at both Department of Defense and Department of State initiatives. So it is many offices across many locations who perhaps don't always have the opportunity or initiative to talk to each other and coordinate and deconflict. I would say that ideally the vision of having contractors there is for to be an enabler, to be a facilitator, and really to be a force multiplier. And whenever I pinned down sort of what that looks like and what the motivations are, even though there are some tensions, which we'll address later, I found that the primary four that it boils down to in favor of the use of contractors is expediency, cost, continuity, and risk dispersal. And so I'm happy to dig down into the specifics of those, but I'll hand it over to Stanislava for her take on the NGO perspective, NGO soft perspective.
Yeah, so exactly, what's happening in these conference rooms? What are these people talking about? Of course, the ultimate question for the military, there's almost like an obsession with, like, what does the end state look like? And because we're talking about some very messy spaces, one of the things that I've encountered in my research is that we get so much obsessed with defining the job, we forget to do the job. And what I mean by that is there's kind of an ambiguity as to what this looks like. So before we get into measure of success, to actually answer your question, what's the point of it all? So certainly for SOF, and particularly where the 95th Brigade, not to get all technical and throw terms at you guys, but basically they're the entity within SOF who are trained in different languages, they're trained in different cultures, they're almost like warrior diplomats, if you will. Certainly this is what they were at their genesis. There's been a whole other thing that's happened with Iraq and Afghanistan, where SOF have gotten away from their roots and become a much more lethal force, which is another discussion altogether. But certainly the number one thing is, Whitney mentioned the confliction, but a lot is also access and placement. Some would say it's a way to understand these populations, or the NGOs. In fact, this is where the NGOs get very prickly, because they feel that the military is there to collect the information about these places so they can do a better job at their missions. And of course, the truth is every organization collects information to do a better job at its mission. It's not, it's kind of how it's used that really gets things very tricky. But the access and placement bit, certainly my research involves, as I mentioned before, budget authorities, providing certain basic services, not for humanitarians, but building a school, digging a well, and so forth. And the argument that I'm making is that, being a humanitarian-like actor and seeking access and placement are not mutually exclusive functions. You could do good by trying to meet the mission at hand. And of course, the moment you put yourself into a humanitarian, which many military will say, I really don't want to call myself one, I'm not one. You encroach on the space of those who truly are doing this work. And that's where it gets really, really tricky. But to caveat it by one additional point is that, because remember, we're talking conflict, post-conflict, pre-conflict, those things are bouncing around each other. Some places are so inaccessible. What I've been saying is that you may not see an international NGO, you might see a national, kind of a sort of a local one, but you may never see a kind of an NGO under its flag or a diplomat in that community, but you will see a military person providing some kind of a civic function. And in the eyes of the populace, who are kind of the most important center of gravity, this becomes the development actor. This becomes the humanitarian actor, even if it's something as small as, providing vaccines to cattle, which is absolutely critical in herd communities, for example. Or whether it's passing around PPE or doing medical exercise and so forth. So it's almost like a multi-face actor that we're constantly trying to engage with here.
Great. So that's helped us understand, Stanislava, for your stuff, kind of how we go from what the initial impetus is to what actually ends up happening, which is much more complex. Whitney, with the actors that you're looking at and working with, what does the reality look like?
Well, so I would first like to go back and kind of frame that the side that I look at is sort of the opposite of what Stanislava described in terms of having maybe an ambiguous goal or trying to figure it out, right? Good contracts should have clear deliverables, but not all contracts are well written, right? Like there are clear statements of work or performance work statements about what the work should be, what the outcome should be. Ideally, they would be tied to strategic goals. That's not always the case, right? So this is a little bit outdated, but Sean McFate, whenever he wrote about the experience of DynCorp being hired to rebuild the Liberian military, right, that statement of work was less than 10 pages. That's not a very specific course of action to follow. So I'm happy to talk about that and sort of windows of opportunity there. I think that all of this leads to the discussion about like the ambiguity of the role of contractors, right? And where that poses problems or tensions in civil relations, and also internal to the mission, right? Because a lot of these contractors are embedded alongside uniformed personnel, but there's often a tension that they're treated as second or third class citizens, right? They don't have authority for fair reason, right? They're supporting the U.S. government. They are not acting on behalf of the U.S. government necessarily. And so you see those tensions. And then there's also security concerns and arming contractors, right? That's what we saw with the Blackwater issues in Nisour Square. Continues to be a challenge in these complex environments where, are you going to allow contractors to be armed in self-defense? Is it personal self-defense? Is it defense of the mandate like it would be with UN peacekeepers? Are we going to allocate US military personnel to act as guardian angels? Will there be third country nationals who will be subcontracted to provide that protection? There are a lot of flow down issues. I mentioned the civil tension and kind of the persona or bravado that comes with a lot of the personalities that you see who have maybe made a career in contingency contracting. There's also individual and organizational conflicts of interest, right? Like is the goal of the contract aligned with the interests of the company? How do you write a contract that addresses those tensions and mitigates the interest misalignments there? And then generally just contract management, right? Like poorly designed contracts, lack of intergovernmental coordination and deconfliction, lack of sufficient oversight, intellectual property control, especially whenever you're looking at training systems that are intellectual property, but they fall under trafficking and arms regulations, right? How are you controlling that? And then the sufficient monitoring and evaluation and accountability mechanisms. So there's no shortage of windows of opportunity to improve the practice.
Yeah, and just even from my own research, I look at peace treaties and the security provisions within peace treaties. And yeah, the idea of you have a very complicated job and you've only been given 10 pages of guidance rings very true. This idea of, and in fact, my entire argument is that you have to be specific, that you actually have to write these things down. And you have to even be specific about how you're going to deal with the things you can't imagine yet. So deciding kind of if something unexpected comes up, we have already decided that this is going to be the decision-making mechanism. Here are the people who are going to be on the committee. Here's who gets what vote. That those things actually can make, quite literally, can make or break whether a peace treaty can successfully end a civil war. So we see this kind of idea of, it's one thing to have goals, but then you also have to write them down, and then you have to write them down in a way that actually translates to the environment. So as you said, and I think perhaps optimistically, windows of opportunity. Windows of opportunity perhaps for things to go wrong. So this kind of leads us on to this next question of, there's clearly a lot of room for confusion within the organization before we even get to actually doing the thing. Just who is doing it, from where, what's the scope, and then we actually get there, and the people actually enacting these actions, again, lots of room for confusion. What kind of relationship are you meant to have with the different pieces of your own organization? What relationship do you have with the local people? How does all of this work? But let's switch for a second to trying to illuminate the confusions perhaps on the other side that I know Stanislava has mentioned a bit. What do people actually on the ground receiving these services, or perhaps next to receiving of those services, if they're not the direct audience, what happens there? What kind of communication is maybe meant to happen? What actually happens? How does this further complicate the picture? So Stanislava, you've already started us off on this, so I will go to you first, and then Whitney, you'll add on from there.
So I just want to preface with quickly saying that because of COVID, I think all of our researchers have had to kind of shift and reconfigure. So I've actually been able to do some interviews remotely, but I've not physically been able to go to the field yet. And a lot of the questions around what do populations think about this have come by talking to the military and NGOs and asking them, what do you think populations think about this? And so just to add to our previous, to kind of an additional answer to the previous question is, whenever we talk about these entities engaging with each other, for those of you that have not had the opportunity to be in the field yet, you kind of get in country and there's the conversation in its official setting and deconflicting, interagency, people talking to each other at the operational level or at the embassy level. But then once you're hundreds of miles away from the embassy and you're actually on the ground, what I argue to be a whole ground operator culture. And these guys are almost like, they're the ones doing the work. And not to say, oh, this strategic document I just agreed with and what I'm going to do X, Y, and Z is going out the window. But the truth is, ground truth is ground truth, and you work with what you have and you need to make decisions. There's a reason why we call them tactical, operational, strategic, and so forth. So if that wasn't messy enough for you, that should kind of further complicate things. With all of that said, this relationship with the populace is extremely important because that's what's feeding the ground truth. So if you're, not to get all military on you, but if you're the target group, and of course you say something like target group to an NGO and they want to run the other way, but what we really mean, a target could be whoever it is you're trying to convince you to deal with. It could be a situation, it could be individuals, could be a problem, and so forth. If you are almost receiving feedback, if you will, that whatever it is that you're trying to do is not working, of course you need to readjust and shape shift. And this is, in my conversations with the military and certainly on the ground is, there's a couple of things. You kind of have the immediate thing that comes to mind. Do I have the electrical line that's running? Am I able to provide for my children, bring food on the table, and so forth? What is this outside actor, whoever they might be, helping me do these basic things? And of course, there's like larger things such as, oh, well, you know, the host nation force is so corrupt and so bad, you know, thank God the Americans are here kind of thing. And of course, you can make this argument, you know, a kind of across the board with any outside actor. But the one thing that's come back consistently is that despite the fact that we think that we know what those needs are, we sometimes do a pretty good job at talking to people and understanding them, and sometimes we don't, because we're so hyper focused on achieving the thing. And of course, people are not fools. In fact, in these zones, people are extremely resilient. It's not their first rodeo. They've been, as we keep saying, they've been shifting, you know, from conflict to post-conflict to pre to outsiders to insiders. These are kind of pretty hot and sophisticated places. Certainly, could be just from a development point of view, or both development and military. And it's kind of, you can say it's kind of mixed. One thing that's popped up is, not to shift on a whole thing on China, but Whitney, you could probably speak to this more, is, you know, Chinese going and doing a lot of development in Africa, for example. And even among my own conversations with colleagues, they say, well, if you go to a person in country in Africa and you say, who do you want developing your road? Who's going to come back and follow up? The military have these very short-term deployments. And much of it is, you know, who's there physically. And if the military is risk averse and doesn't decide not to go somewhere, which sometimes they are, then you almost have like a lack of presence. But from an idealistic point of view and kind of whose values you ascribe to, some would say, well, if you kind of went to a community and you told the person, here's a passport for China, here's a passport for the US, where would you rather go? You know, I'll let you all come up with your own philosophical answers to this question. But it's almost a kind of overall larger competition. And of course, the people in the middle are the populations, and it could go one way or the other. And I'll stop here because I have a lot more to add to this topic, but I'll leave it for Whitney to respond.
Yeah, thanks. I agree with a lot of that. And I wouldn't presume to speak on behalf of a recipient stakeholder, even though I've been very fortunate to have a lot of field experience. But I think that there's not as much appreciation or integration of the host nation perspective as I think ideally we might want in terms of the contract design. I would say, though, that I think that that's circumstantial rather than intentional in a lot of cases, because many US government entities themselves don't often have the freedom of movement to get that ground truth, right? Like they're inside the wire because of force protection issues, which is why contractors and implementing partners who are outside of chief of mission authority are then hired as a measure of risk dispersal that I mentioned earlier, so that they can go out into those higher risk environments to collect that information. And I would also note that I think that this goes back to intergovernmental deconfliction, is that maybe the reporting that then goes back to the contracting officer, there's often some loss of utility in that translation about what maybe the implementing partner's recommendations might be and what is actually feasible within that mechanism, or you know, under the policies of that particular sponsor. So yeah, it gets to a lot of technical bureaucratic paperwork, but that feedback does need to be more efficiently, I think, integrated into changes in the scope of statements of work.
And so picking up on that, we've actually got a great comment anonymously in the Q&A. So thank you for popping that in, saying that as someone who normally works on the ground and who has been working a lot with ensuring there are avenues for affected populations to express opinions and perceptions on the humanitarian aid response, I can strongly confirm that NGOs and military actors' ideas about how they are perceived by communities needs to be approached with immense caution. We are rarely seen the way we think we are. And I think what's been really helpful in both of your responses is helping illuminate some of the reasons that those perceptions can be so off. Some of the ways in which internally, externally, both of those things combined, that the types of information available, the ways of collecting that information, the ways of reporting that information, the ways of understanding that information make it even harder to understand what the recipient population might be thinking. And of course, we always have that issue of no one knows what the other person thinks about them. That's just a general human thing. And it was, I think, really helpful in your last answer, the both of you, to illuminate just how many extra barriers there are in terms of getting that perception. So thank you for that comment in the Q&A. Please do keep your questions and comments coming. Stani, go ahead.
Yes, I just want to add one more thing, because this is kind of thing, how do you know? With a lot of, how do you know what people are really thinking? One of the things which has come up a lot in conversations with interviewees is because this is the gray zone and it's all about ambiguity, and as opposed to try to put things in, the military is all about quantitative. This is part of my research was, what is the military doing? What does it feel comfortable with, which is quants and predictability and percentages and so forth, ability to make quick decisions. So whatever they're doing, I'll do just the opposite of that. So in conducting qualitative interviews, which is really kind of lean into the uncomfort of the work. And much of it has been around how do you measure? How do you know? In some cases, it's like there is no way to kind of hear people say it. Yes, it's all kind of hearsay. People will tell you one thing or another, but there's also a behavioral component to it. For example, if you feel, how do you know the security situation is improving? Maybe people are going out into the marketplace more often. Maybe they're going and taking their kids with them versus before, where if things are on the brink of breaking down, they would just be in and out. Maybe shops are open longer. Maybe children are playing around. I always turn it back to what would you do in your own community if you're an active shooter? You'd probably stay inside the house. What would you do if things were feeling okay? You'd probably go roaming around the town or doing things and so forth. So some of it is so much through the lens of security, we forget to think that the gray space could mean different things for different people. I always use the argument of if you were the IMF or the World Bank, what could be chasing the black for the military could be a country on the brink of economic collapse for the IMF, where they're no longer willing to issue a tranche of money because the conditions weren't met. So there's so many lenses through which to view this. And the whole idea here is to understand that other actors see it differently. An NGO not being able to physically get there, talking about private security companies with me, they probably have to go hire someone to give them the security they need to operate in the space. So it's so multi-lens. The least favor we can do ourselves is have this very myopic view, the need mission, because we're not planning. When we have those objectives and we're planning the mission, part of the plan is the military is not how well do I interact with the NGOs, it's how well do I meet the mission and talk to the populations and win them over, if you will, regardless of who else is trying to do the same.
If I may just jump in on that, I would flag that I think that there's been a very positive step in addressing that through the 2018 Stabilization Assistance Review, which was a joint project between the Department of Defense, Department of State, and USAID, which was just a huge step in looking at what's the interagency approach to stabilization. I think we're not calling it stability operations anymore. I think it's just stabilization writ large, but it takes years for that to trickle down to the different communities and especially to the different contracts, because contracts are written and allocated, fiscal years in advance. But I would just flag that as, a heartening opportunity that was taken advantage of.
So actually on that, Whitney, I was wondering if you could give us a bit more in terms of these contracts. When we go back to this question of how do you measure? What is actually taken into account? Stanislava, you've given us a great idea of kind of the operational, the tactical stuff that you can actually observe. How much of that is actually in those contracts? What do the contracts, in your experience, Whitney, what do they measure? What are they looking for?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't think that there's really an answer or a satisfying answer because of the variety of contracting mechanisms and authorities, right? So it depends on the type of contract. Is it an IDIQ, which is indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity, and then there are specific task orders that fall under that really huge contract mechanism, right? Which is why we see so much like subcontracting down through companies. So that, you know, you get one company that is very specialized who's providing a service to a bigger company, right? And that just kind of adds to the potential interest misalignment. Sorry, the coffee hasn't kicked in, so I completely like forgot.
Given that there's so many different kinds of contracts, are there any similarities that you've seen, even just within a particular type of contract or within a particular type of space, in terms of the types of things that they are looking to measure as success or failure?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I would like to see more is sort of like, what are the capability outcomes, rather, I mean, specifically for the training programs, security force assistance programs, is like, what capacity have we built, rather than how many students or attendees have we graduated, right? And is it actually, you know, for these training programs, did they complete the program, or did they graduate from the program, right? Like, did they show up every day, or did they actually demonstrate proficiency in the skills that they were supposed to be building? So that trickles down to the tactical level. It's much harder to track, right, at like the ministerial level whenever we're looking at organizational capacity building, because, you know, how would you do that in the US, right? Like, how efficient is the Department of Defense? And right, like different stakeholders would have different evaluations of that. And no, to my knowledge, there is not a uniform kind of profile of what these programs would ideally deliver. But I would say that for the Department of Defense, I believe it was a year or two ago, because now they've been filling the billets, there was a huge oversight contract issued through the Defense Security Cooperation Agency. So perhaps even internal to DoD, they are looking at, you know, how do we standardize this and sort of translate lessons identified into lessons learned.
So that brings us really nicely on to our next question, which was not only brought up in the Q&A, but was on our plan to talk about next anyway. So it's lovely how those things go together. Let's talk about this idea of lessons learned. First of all, is that even a thing? Can we learn lessons that are applicable from one situation to another, even, for example, the same place, the same people, but a very different sort of security situation? Is that even possible, to take lessons from one place and move them either to another place or to another time, or both? Is lessons learned even a useful thing for us to be thinking about? Stanislava, do you want to start off?
Yes. You know, this is, I think, the ultimate question that we, as of course, we're practitioners, we go into this academic exercise, we want to come back out with some like very, you know, oracles, like, here's the answer to the lesson we should learn and apply. I don't, unfortunately, I mean, of course, it goes back to measurement and all the things we've been discussing, but I think it's much, because I'm looking at the how as opposed to the what or the why. What I found is that if I can kind of reconfigure the question, thank you so much by the way, to the audience for this. And I'd like to give it in the context of behavior that I've seen in terms of my interviewees. And I interviewed, as I mentioned, the NGOs and the military, and to some extent populations, but particularly in the NGOs in the military, I will break them down into sort of roughly 3 groups. What I call the loyalists, the enlightened, and the converted. And I can speak to which group feels most or least comfortable with kind of the lessons learned thing. The loyalists are sort of the group which is very keen on, you know, the mission. You know, we as an agency are at the center of the universe. We need to meet our mission and so forth. The loyalists came both on the NGO and the military side. And they didn't really see coordination with civic actors or non-state actors necessarily as bad, but they just kind of were very, very honed in on doing their work, which of course ties into lessons learned, because we keep talking about the need to talk to each other and with other actors. And yet you see this group that's kind of like, well, I showed up and I made one call and the guy didn't get back to me from X NGO and I moved on with my life, which of course is not as we all know, it's sort of like operational art. There's definitely a science to it. The enlightened is the group that actually was more comfortable with the notion of that lessons learned are not always lessons applied, but we need to keep trying. And they're the group that did not see the engagement with civic actors as neither good nor bad. They kind of saw it as necessary. They understood that this is a complicated space, that you sometimes are making it up as you go along, and sometimes you have an amazing plan that you as a company took 10 years to come up with the formula to having a great operational plan, and understand the uncomfort that comes with the fact that you can't measure it all, you can measure some, but it doesn't mean that you should stop trying. And the third group basically are the converted, and these are, of course, people that sort of went in the other direction and said, it's all wrong. We can never learn our lesson, and I'm giving it up. War is immoral. I've been in the military for X amount of years. War is immoral. I need to. I'm now kind of joining the other side. Or in some cases, you see people who were in the Peace Corps and then decided to go via the civil affairs route. And of course, to answer all this is you almost need three groups. You need like a black hat and a white hat and someone that's constantly questioning you, because this is where you identify what your lessons are. You don't know what you don't know. So a lesson is all about, we did it wrong. We could have done it differently. And there's someone that can help us, or we just kind of keep trying on our own. So I know I'm not giving an answer to this audience's question, but my argument is that if we think about it that way, we might be getting closer to the outcome.
I love that framing. I think that's really useful of those groups and sort of what their buy-in level is. I would say that from my side, I think that like the biggest way to translate a lesson that was identified into a lesson learned is to have that on the ground contextual awareness and knowledge, which is why I think contractors are often used for that continuity, right? Like when I managed program in Afghanistan, a number of my guys had been there for 6 or 7 years, right? Like those personal relationships and that advising and that experience, right? Like embedded at the ministerial level, like can't be duplicated, right? And whenever you have military personnel who are, coming in and out every like 6, 9, 18 months, right? It takes the first 3 months for them to have a clue what's going on. Then they have X period of time to actually like do their job. And then, there's like a 2 or 3 month handover period at the end. And that handover period is generous. And that is, if the next person actually comes for a replacement in place training, or if it's just, like, here are my handover notes, like, this is the guy's, like office, like, good luck. That's such an incredible loss of institutional memory. And right, if you were on the partner nation side to know that like these, your advisors, your mentors are coming in and out, just about every year, what if you don't get along with them personally? You just wait them out. You wait for the next person to come along, or if they're pushing an agenda that doesn't align with what your institutional agenda is, right? Because of interest misalignment, maybe between what like the donor nation wants and the recipient institution feels that they need, right? It's a waiting game. I would also say that leads us to the trap of like the insularity that I often see in these like complex environments of the donor nations and international stakeholders, right? Like they will be in a green zone, they will stay in the bubble of their camp, they will not necessarily talk to each other, and their experiences aren't informed by the reality outside of the wire, in the camps, in the ministries, on the front lines necessarily. And I think that that's where we see the highest threat of repeating the mistakes of the lessons that we identified before, but haven't really like mobilized into a change in the actual execution of the programming.
So
if I could just add please. one more bit in my own findings. So Whitney's been talking about private security companies, and a lot of them are retired military or people that have kind of left their career. But what I've also observed is that some of the NGOs themselves recruit individuals who are from the military. Again, this is the civic affairs hub. Otherwise, if you've gone from like, you know, SF, like highly lethal, to like being a Birkenstock, it's very unlikely. That's probably the third category I talked about. But what we're finding is that there is almost like an underground, if you will, institutional link where these people know one another, they work with one another. And now they see it from the other perspective. So a lesson learned opportunity would be, oh, now I'm on the other side. Oh, now I see why the NGOs are doing it this way. Oh, maybe I can, now I have sort of my, you know, my blind spots have been unblinded because I see it. Oh, and who's in the middle? Oh, it's all these populations or ministries or, you know, recipients that we're trying to work with. So as you see this shift, and I can't speak to from, you know, like from an HR perspective, why NGOs do it. So why some NGOs choose to do it this way. Of course, there's lots of work with armed groups and so forth that, you know, that makes a military person like a very good candidate for this kind of stuff. But what's important to remember is that you are having this institutional knowledge from the, you know, other organization that's now shifting into the one which is always in the eyes of DoD. Let's face it, DoD is such a big machine and kind of a big master on the ground, specifically in a non-permissive space. It's extremely difficult to compete with them, and maybe we don't need to. That's part of the lessons learned. But we're seeing a lot of very interesting dynamics going on. And now I'm making the argument with the war in Afghanistan ending, you have a whole generation of, you know, contractors that are coming to an end, people that have this amazing experience that are going to go and get employed somewhere, whether it be security companies, whether it be the NGO space, whether, you know, whatever it might be. But I am predicting that there's definitely going to be some kind of an absorption of these experiences in individuals, and it's very much going to drive what this space might look like.
So that actually brings me quite nicely to the other part of the question for the both of you, which is that if we are thinking that there's some validity in this idea of lessons learned, with all of the caveats that we've raised, but there's some things sometimes that can be learned in some situations if done properly. In your experience, your research, your work, etc., are there any examples that you've seen of good practice? I hesitate to say best practice, but good practice that, even if it's a tiny example, like you've only seen it once, but you're like, you know what? Maybe if that was expanded just beyond once, that might be nice. So not so much what are your biggest lessons learned, but what are perhaps the most overlooked ones, or ones that you've seen happen a little bit, but could do with some expanding. Doesn't need to be an exhaustive list, but if there's one or two things that kind of pop into your head as, ooh, that looked kind of good. I wish we saw a bit more of that. If there's anything that particularly springs to mind, my entire PhD, I had a whole chapter on all of the lessons learned. So I took a very direct method with this in terms of how to write peace treaties. But yeah, if either of you have any, perhaps starting with Stanislava.
Yes, the one thing which comes to mind, it's a great question, by the way, because we're always focusing like what's broken and why it's not working, or what's great and why could it potentially work. The one area, so there's a whole notion to kind of, winning hearts and minds around this, certainly around my topic. And the thing that comes to mind oftentimes is, so I'll pick Colombia, for example. The US has had a very long relationship with Colombia. It's historic. We've been kind of training their forces. And one of the examples which came to mind was, first of all, any organization's branch which deals with civilians can be very demonstrative of how the host nation military sees civilians as actors in the conflict. So there's not a separation between, like here's the military and here's everybody else. No, we're all actors in the same space. And one of the great examples that I've observed through conversations is the professionalization of the civil affairs branch for the Colombian military, where they really talk about working yourself out of a job. Great examples of where they have such a tight-knit sort of in with the populace that it's there's kind of, the soft professional being in the background and not really doing anything, just kind of showing up for the medcap, for the medical, sort of for the, it's like they're like medics who, they provide Planned Parenthood, they provide preventative checkup and so forth. So really seeing the host nation military in the lead, meaning that it's called acción integral. And this is kind of the ultimate success, right? Like you want to leave and the place is supposed to be fine to function on its own. And it's the person that said to me, all I had to do was just show up and somebody showed me my seat. I want to always preface that by also the fact that there's NGO involvement. So there's definitely like host nation military NGOs talking vis-a-vis each other. Of course, ideally, in an ideal world, you could say, well, the military shouldn't be involved at all. They should just be left to the civic authorities. But as we know, there's countries that are constantly shifting. They're like almost in a permanent state of conflict and deconfliction. So we just need to accept that there's a permanence to the civil military interaction in these cases. And if the military is going to be providing services, this is what it means for the here and now. And it's how they do it, as opposed to by force. They do it because people want to. What that looks like on the recipient side, of course, is a different question too. But to understand that there is a function and void they can fill. And how they do it really drives these perceptions, not so much as to what they're doing. Like if a person's getting their Tylenol from someone and they need it, it doesn't matter who's giving it to them, but they need to have it, versus if the actors are fighting each other out as to who should be responsible for this. I don't know if that answers it, but it's the first thing that comes to mind. There's lots more, of course.
Whitney, are there any you can think of?
Yeah, so I would start with like know the history and know the environment so that you understand the drivers of stability and instability and the priorities of your partners, both individually and organizationally, right? Like there's a quote that I'm probably going to butcher a bit, which is, if you don't know history, you're a leaf that doesn't know it's part of a tree, right? And that's sort of that knowledge of the history and the background and the context ties into the second recommendation that I would have, which is, get to know the other stakeholders in your space. Like no one buddy like knows more than everybody collectively. So like use that, bring that together, talk to other people, have that understanding of their work and their perspective, like frame your understanding, right? And scaffold the work that you're doing. And I think that also speaks to the permanence that Stanislava highlighted of the military, right? Like you're not going into these unstable environments and thinking that, well, I don't know, I guess maybe some people do, but it would not be the most holistic approach to go into these environments and think that you can really affect change without having it be, your efforts be aware of and informed by what some of the biggest inputs and stakeholders are doing.
Great. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And I'll just add a few on the peace treaty side, the actual writing and implementation of this. And it's one that I mentioned earlier, is having a plan for when things go wrong. Actually writing down and having everyone agree ahead of time, how are you going to deal with unforeseen issues, particularly when there are so many different stakeholders involved. When you're looking at, well, there's a UN mission, which in and of itself, how many countries are involved in that mission? There are multiple different diplomats on the ground. There are the local military. Sometimes there are 2 militaries or 3. There's also different ministries. You've got the ministry that's paying for everything versus the ministry that's technically in charge of everything. There's a lot of actors to potentially deconflict. And so one of the practices that I've seen is just having a plan in advance for how you're going to try and deconflict those things. Even if it's something just as simple as there will be a committee and one person from each of these entities will be on that committee. They will meet every week. And in the event of a tied vote, this is the organization that gets to break that tie. Can be that simple. But having that plan and having all of those stakeholders sign on to that plan before things actually start is incredibly helpful, at least from the research that I've done. So we've got about half an hour left-ish. So please do keep the Q&A coming. If we've got some good ones already. So let's kind of pick up some things that have been mentioned. First of all, this topic of Afghanistan, Iraq, the idea that we've got a ton of people who have had all sorts of experience now, and kind of what's going to happen next. Specifically, we've got a question from one of our audience members, Jim, about what do we think with all this experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, is it all going to unravel? And more importantly, and perhaps more relevantly, what has been learnt or not learnt in all of this experience? So perhaps Whitney, the idea of institutional memory might be a place to start.
Yeah, I think generally I'll defer to Stanislava. I think that she spent a lot more time in Afghanistan than I did, so I can speak to the longer term picture. But I have been very impressed and very privileged to work with ministries in Afghanistan and seeing the progress that they've made in institutional reform and oversight, and really building institutions that work for them, or seeking to build institutions that work for them, rather than necessarily having institutions that were designed for them without enough I don't know, without enough contextual input. But it's a wicked problem, and I don't have much more to say on that at this point.
Fair enough. Admitting when we don't know things, as we all know, is a really key part of research. Stanislava, anything you want to add?
I think that if the question is what we think will happen to Afghanistan, with, of course, the big news that has come out recently, I would not allow myself to take a guess on this. We all have perspectives. If you ever want to know, just put on CNN, MSNBC, any of them at night, and I'm sure plenty of people can guess on this. But because we are, I'd like to think we're of the tribe that's looking forward and see how we can do this stuff in the future better. I think one of the key things exactly is I think we've mentioned it, and I will say it again, to make sure that we understand that wherever we go next, or whatever, wherever these actors have been talking about get employed next, is not like where they've just come from. And I've had people tell me this, Mali, for example. I had a couple of interviews talk about, well, we were just told that, Mali's like Afghanistan, which goes completely against everything we've been talking about, that no two contexts look alike. And if there's almost a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy in this, that if you treat something like the other thing, it becomes that thing. To really break it down in simple terms for this early in the morning. But the truth is, no two conflicts are alike. And the notion of kind of sitting back and understanding, as Whitney was saying, the historic hand, bringing together, Miranda, you mentioned different parties. Everyone talks about coordination, but no one really likes to be coordinated, especially when you're dealing with some, pretty alpha-driven cultures, and you have competition of. I always say that you can have multiple masters on the ground, which is what we've been talking about, but the one with the most power, the most money and equipment, generally would be the military, especially if you have a bigger footprint, would be the master of them all. So I think what we do need to think about is that there were moments with Iraq and Afghanistan, certainly around CERP, Commander's Emergency Response Program, which is where a lot of this humanitarian development stuff came in, where the military really went out. I mean, Afghanistan, again, is big. It was a nation building exercise. It was a very different context. I think what is good for us to remember, just because these things didn't work in a kind of the greater context in the big wars, they're not all bad in the smaller context. There is utility for stability operations. There is utility for doing humanitarian types of projects, even if the military cannot be humanitarian. So let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater and think about the fact that some of these things work. Just because they didn't work in a particular place doesn't mean that we're not doing them, period. And one of my findings has been that no one really the military doesn't, I guess it's not just the military, it's all of us. We don't like to do things we're not good at and successful at. So we're just gonna stop doing them. that's the wrong approach. It defeats the purpose of thinking outside of our comfort zone and operating the gray space. The gray space is basically everything between full-on peace and full-on war. So go figure, 95% of what we do. So I would say that we need to remember we really need to remember the lessons and reapply them with all the respect of the context with which we're working, because these things are not playgrounds and experimental cases. These are real people and real conflicts and real impact. And if you get it wrong, you can really have a very, very, you can create the do no harm, again, is a whole other topic in this field, but it can be extremely dangerous.
Yeah, I would just, applaud you for that and echo that and just say also generally, at the human level, it's rude to show up in a country, right? Or in any relationship, right? And be like, well, I had this experience, so I'm just going to project that onto you, right? Like the lessons that we identified / learned should be seen as like a menu of options that are informative in terms of like their structuring, but not prescriptive and in mandating tunnel vision. So there's a lot to be learned. I don't know. I guess we shouldn't say learned whenever we're criticizing here. There's a lot to be observed about how these interventions can be tailored and contextualized.
Fair enough. So we've got kind of two interesting questions. We're now firmly in the Q&A section of things, so please keep them coming. So we've got questions about kind of these different actors and how they do or do not agree with each other. So the first one came through the Q&A, which is the idea of, are we sure that humanitarian / development NGOs and civil military SOF share the same objectives? So I think we've pretty clearly answered so far that no, they definitely do not need to share the same objectives and probably often don't. So I'm going to pick up the second part of the question. Surely across the defense contracts, there are some shared objectives. So is it better to have something kind of systemic? Is that out there? And then the questioner, Justin, also offered a everyday peace indicators as a resource for people to look at in terms of local populations' perception of security. So perhaps, Whitney, you could pick this up. In the contracts that you look at and analyze, to what extent are there shared objectives, even just amongst a particular category? If you're just looking at Department of Defense contractors, is it different every single time? Do those objectives stay the same more than they should? Kind of how do we understand what these objectives look like and how responsive they are?
Yeah, that's just a very difficult question to answer because of, again, like how many different contracting authorities there are and how many different sort of, not necessarily chains of command, but like actors in different spaces, right? Like SOCOM, Special Operations Command, could be putting out contracts, that differ, like have a similar aim as maybe like what the Office of Transition Initiatives at USAID is doing, and they could be doing them, in the same space, but not necessarily always getting on the same page to the extent that would be ideal, right? Which is why it comes back to my approach that like everybody should talk to everybody that they can, right? And streamline those objectives. Although I know that this is DoD specific, but I would also say that like DoD is so big that it's maybe not a rational ask that every contracting office knows or has visibility. I mean, they should have access, right? But not necessarily immediate visibility on what other contracting offices are putting out. But as I mentioned, I think that the DISCA contract that came out, well, right, interesting that it's a contract about contracting, about security force assistance is a step in that right direction to make sure that there is that communication across the enterprise.
Lovely, thank you. And then moving to Stanislava, I've got a bit of a different related question for you that came from our watchers on YouTube, which is exciting, so thank you for that. This idea of specifically post-conflict regeneration, so I suppose I can probably speak to that a bit as well. This idea of kind of who are the best actors for this? When we look at kind of recovery, regeneration, do we think that that is something that's best placed for NGOs to work on? Is that military actors? Is that the private sector? Is that some combination? So what kind of are your initial thoughts, perhaps, on the role of NGOs vis-a-vis other kinds of actors, particularly in either, I suppose, moving away from kind of a tense time to a more peaceful time, whether or not an official conflict has happened, versus in the kind of official post-conflict time period? How would you sort of think about that?
I mean, I think the automatic answer is that you want to be able to have a government that can perform the services which NGOs are performing. But of course, that's pie in the sky. If that could get fixed, I'm sure we would have figured it out, or somebody would have figured it out, and we would have found a way for this to happen. And not to take us off on a limb, but look, the world population is growing. Just if you were to think about, X amount of people per one service provider, whether that be military, police, doctors, nurses, security, health, food, you name it, very hierarchical. This is kind of what it gets to. We can very much predict that there's a shortage of these things. I don't really have a kind of a specific core answer. But what is interesting is that local NGOs, we talk about NGOs, but these people are not just NGO workers, they also live in the community. They're recruited from the communities in which they work. So maybe we shouldn't get too much ahead of ourselves and think that we can get it all fixed in our lifetime, but understand that there's a much stronger link between those in need and those providing the need, and becomes almost this ecosystem in and of itself. A big thing that international NGOs have been doing is we're trying to hire as many local staff as they can. There's a whole thing between international and national NGO staff, but basically it's they better understand the needs. What better way to have someone work on the need than the people who have the need to begin with be part of the thinking and the mission planning. And to understand that is its own, that is kind of its own, it's always going to be a separate thing to tackle. There's no way for me to deploy a SOF, civil affairs, whoever, come back to my hub in Fort Bragg and have figured it all out. And that's another thing, right? That the hub for the need and meeting the need, understanding the context is there on the ground. It's in our communities. It's the neighborhood in DC where you are right now with me, and I'm sitting in New York. And I mean, these are, this is, all politics is local, not to take us down to basics, but kind of that's what it comes down to. And the culture that exists within SOF in doing this stuff, they all come back, they train together, they look at the same thing together. It's kind of this reinforcing thing about the problem. Same thing happens at the local level. So that kind of gives you some flavor of an answer, but it's I would say one bite at a time, and to recognize that there is a real agency that is within, integral, and absolutely critical, and without it, without agency of the populace and the people we're trying to benefit, it kind of defeats the purpose.
So that answer actually beautifully leads on to the next question that's just come through the Q&A, which I'm going to direct at Whitney, if you don't mind, as it focuses pretty heavily on private contractors. So the question from an anonymous attendee: does the increasing focus on localization of humanitarian response, so the things that Stanislava has just talked about, get much of an airing outside the humanitarian sphere in these operating environments? If so, how does it take shape with private contractors in particular? If it's there, is it typically driven by donor governments or by the contractors or someone else? So this whole idea of things should be local, does that actually trickle down anywhere, Whitney?
Yeah, because a lot of the times, well, actually, I just want to go back real quick and just say, Stanislava, I think that you hit the nail on the head and all that stuff. And ideally, for security force assistance and defense institution building, we want to be working ourselves out of a job, right? We want to be building the capacity of the host nation government to be able to robustly support its citizenry. Sorry, so I just saw that there was a follow-on to that question that popped up. So yeah, the localization, a lot of the time so the demand for the contract, right? The demand signal is coming from that complex environment, right? Like sometimes the good idea fairy in Washington, D.C., like will come up with a contract and the contractors will arrive and be like, okay, well, like who wrote this? It doesn't really have a lot of ground truth, but I'd say that overwhelmingly it's maybe not overwhelmingly, significantly, substantially, it's that there was a need identified in the ground. The demand signal went back to DC for the contract to be written, for the contractors to come out and deliver that work or assistance. So this does go back to sort of like the possibility that things could get lost in translation between an entity leaving the wire and articulating what that need is, what the demand is, it going to the contracting officer, all of the legal considerations that go into what can be performed, right? There's also an entire section of work performance that's considered inherently governmental that contractors shouldn't be undertaking. But there is a consideration of the local environment, right? I mean, this is also a very difficult question to answer, right? Because are we talking about DOD? Are we talking about Department of State? Are we talking about the USAID? Like what sort of intervention does this question triangulate to? But I would say that it is the best contracts are the demand-driven ones that are coming from the ground.
Okay, lovely. I think that I love how those responses went together. So thank you for our Q&A for allowing us to do that. So I don't see any other questions. So I'll use this time while we see if any others want to come in. Please give us your questions. But is there kind of anything else either of you would like to put in from your research? Anything you found that's particularly interesting, perhaps to our audience? Anything that you really want people to take away? It's kind of a little bit of a free-for-all while we see if there are any other questions, starting with Whitney.
I would just say that it's been such a privilege over the last couple of years to engage with this community academically, in addition to sort of the practitioner side that was more my past. For any of the younger students earlier students who are out there, I would definitely say make sure that you're involved in like the right communities of practice, right? So for me, that's IUS, that's ERGOMAS, it's the Conflict Research Society, it's the Peace Science Society, right? It's even just reaching out to people via Twitter or LinkedIn who maybe you wouldn't necessarily cross paths with otherwise, but are very interested in their work. So actually Stanislava and I were connected through LinkedIn maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And this is the first time that we're actually interacting like this, but we email back and forth regularly. And that's also part of the idea that it takes a village, right? It's not only a village in the terms of contracting, but it's also in this this academic practice and for me, my interest in making my scholarship policy relevant. So yeah, I guess that would be my biggest note there.
Yeah, and just to pick up on that, I mean, this is a brilliant example. We're all currently PhD students in the School of Security Studies. I know the both of you. I don't think any of us have ever met in person. In fact, none of us have met in person. And yet we've had all sorts of incredibly helpful conversations, professionally, chats, research, all manner of things have happened. And that is really a testament to the importance of having and creating that kind of community. So that was lovely to have that in there. And look, people are even willing to wake up at 4 in.the morning to speak on a panel for someone that they've never met in person. Stanislava, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, no, I also, I'm really grateful for this opportunity. I hope that we provided collectively something to the audience and you have some thoughts to take away with you. I think that this new medium of communicating this way has proven that things are much more accessible than we think. Before, it used to be about, doing in-person interviews, engaged in meetings in person and so forth. I think we're kind of in a renaissance of research. I think we're understanding that maybe some of the answers that we're looking for are literally a Zoom call away. With that being said, being completely understanding that that's not how it works, and you need to be in person to build trust and to have relationships vis-a-vis others. And, a Zoom may not tell you, what it smells like in the Amazon, but it will definitely give you a perspective. I think much like with the work that we're doing on lessons learned in our respective fields, is to really question the status quo and question whether the way we've been doing it is the right way to do it, and encourage all of you to talk to one another and be very bold in your thinking and ideas. And bureaucracies, I mean, what we're talking about, Whitney and I and Miranda with her work, bureaucracies are difficult to change. They take a long time. They're formed by humans, and at the end of the day, they are human enterprise. People having a need for assistance on one end is no different than people needing to do a job for a paycheck inside a bureaucracy, or wanting to meet the mission. So at the end of the day, there's always a human behind each of this. And I think certainly an opportunity for there to be more connectivity, regardless of where we physically happen to be.
Lovely. So we have got one additional question, and if there are any others out there in the universe, please send them in. We've got about 10 minutes left, so we might have time for one more after this one. Now, it's a bit of a long and involved question, so I'm not going to read it all out. I'm going to sort of distill it to what I think is the core essence. Which is this idea of, particularly with private military contractors, quote, mercenaries. We've tried to stay on the optimistic side, but let's dive into it. How can this go wrong? Should we be thinking of mercenaries in the same lens as former foreign fighters in terrorist groups? Should retired mercenaries be thought of in the same way as former ISIS fighters? As security risks, as legal things to be adjudicated? Where do we draw that line? Can we draw that line? So how do we understand this, given the proliferation of non-state actors of all sorts of different kinds? And for probably obvious reasons, Whitney, I'm going to put you on the spot with this one.
Yeah, I'd say that we can draw very, very clear distinctions, right, based on the UN definition of what is a mercenary, right? There are 6 very clear guidelines that dictate what a mercenary is. And similar with foreign fighters, actually the work of Dr. David Mallet has addressed this, about how are foreign fighters different / overlapping than mercenaries. And then the entire body of scholarship that I look at, which is these companies who are legally contracted under international law, right, are members of international code of conduct associations, are clearly vetted by governments who employ them, right, are subscribing to working within a legal system, are completely different than the mercenaries of pop culture, really. I'm not saying that they don't exist, but I'm saying that that's a completely different argument than to really discuss the appropriate typology of PMFs, PMCs, PSCs, PMSCs, depending, on what categorization you prefer, right? And then can dig down into that a little bit more about what are the different types of services that these companies provide, right? Is it logistics? Is it the kidnapping and ransom insurance that goes with it, or is it the tactical field advising? All very different and all highly regulated within the industry versus mercenaries and foreign fighters.
Wonderful answer. I knew you would have one. Thank you. Always fascinated to learn about definitions of aspects of security that I don't personally research directly. So thank you for that. I'm now going to go look up those 6 UN criteria just because I'm curious now. I'm sure I'm not going to be the only one. So as we've sort of come to the end of this, I don't see any further questions. So I really just want to finally thank you both for this, Whitney and Stanislava. I really appreciate you both being here and waking up really early. I hope that this was as interesting for you both as it was for me. Audience watching, I hope you learned some things, got some food for thought, maybe ranted at your screen a little bit, who knows? So I hope this is interesting, and I strongly recommend that all of those watching check out some other events in the School of Security conference. And yeah, get in touch with any of us if you are interested in learning more about our individual research. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.